Celtic Knotwork looks intricate, but stitching it by machine is absolutely possible. For designs like this, you can even applique and quilt in one step. Hi, I'm Beth Williams, and in this video, I'll show you how I machine applique my Celtic Knotwork quilts using techniques that I've been exploring and playing with for over 30 years. We'll cover what distinguishes a Celtic-style design, and I'll walk you through my applique and quilt process step by step. Let's start with 3 elements common to historic Celtic knotwork and interlace. First, all lines are continuous, having neither beginning nor end. Next, all lines cross each other in an alternating over-under pattern. And finally, no more than 2 lines cross at any given point. When it comes to creating or adapting Celtic-style design for machine applique, I add a few more design considerations of my own. The lines are spaced sufficiently far apart that when covered by my bias-cut tubes, the design still looks nice and clean. The curves are gentle enough that they can be sewn without having the fabric bunch or buckle, and the points are not so sharp or skinny that the fabric becomes too bulky. In addition, I made all of the quilts in my Celtic Quilts book with my favorite method, invisible machine applique and quilt in one step. Let's look at how this works with the Celtic Blessings quilt. Just so we're all on the same page, here's a diagram showing the various parts of the quilt that we'll be looking at today. The background is the fabric on which I'll trace the design, and the knotwork refers to the design itself. The insets refer to the negative space between the lines of the design. You can leave these areas empty, add some quilting later for texture, or, as I'm doing here, fill in some of the spaces with fabric to create a secondary design. You can skip borders or add borders, whatever you prefer. For this quilt, I opted for a single border with cornerstones in the same fabric that I used for the insets. The first step is to trace the design onto the background fabric, and the next is to fuse any optional insets in place. Here I'm using Steam-A-Seam 2 to fuse my inset fabrics to the background. That's my favorite fusible to use because it is repositionable. I find it helpful to go back to my light box and trace over any design lines that may have been covered up by the inset fabrics. The next step is to prepare the bias tubes that will be used in the applique design. I begin by cutting strips of quilting weight cotton on the bias and folding and sewing each strip into a tube, pretty side out. It's more steps, but I find that in most cases it's easier for me to get smooth, tight curves and sharp points with these flexible bias tubes than it would be with folded bias tape. For the next step, I use a press bar or pressing bar. I like the plastic bars the best as they're economical, do not get as hot as the metal bars, which can burn your fingers, and they're more stable than the nylon bars. Here, I'm sliding the fabric tube onto the 3/8 inch wide bias press bar, roughly centering the seam allowance as I go. Next, I'll press the fabric as it comes off the bar, and I try to press the seam allowances all in the same direction, but it's not a big deal if it's not perfect. Now the fabric tubes have been trimmed and pressed with the seam allowances on the back side. Let's talk about how I'll position them smoothly on the fabric. First of all, I don't recommend using pins. They will only poke you and get in the way. Ask me how I know this. All I'll say is that blood was involved. When I first started working with Celtic and Celtic-style designs, I used 1/4 inch wide strips of Steam-A-Seam 2, which is that pressure-sensitive adhesive I told you about earlier. It holds the fabric in place temporarily until you press it with an iron to fuse it permanently, which makes it repositionable until you press it. This is still a good option. But some years later, I discovered Roxanne Glue-Basted. I love that it only takes small droplets of glue to hold the fabric in place. It dries very quickly, especially when you run a hot iron over the fabric, and it's water soluble, so it's easy to dampen and reposition something if necessary. Do you notice a theme here? I also love that it can be washed out when the quilt is complete, so no adhesive stays in the quilt. If you can find it, I strongly recommend the Easy Squeezy bottle. It's much easier on your hands. You can also substitute other water-soluble glue, even Elmer's washable school glue, as long as you have a fine enough applicator or fine enough control that you can squeeze out tiny droplets instead of big glops. Big glops can ruin your quilt. Here's how I place tiny drops of glue along the design, skipping the intersections where lines cross each other. And these intersections are shown in the red circles. Now that's not all the intersections in the design, but just the intersections that fall on the path where this tube will go. I gently stretch the bias tube around the curve and press it with a hot iron to heat set it. Hot, dry iron. Ideally, the seam allowance underneath the tube should be pointing away from the inside curve, and I tried to show this in this photo with those little red arrows near the bottom of the photo. Here, I can see that I don't have quite enough tube left to make it to the next intersection. I can't end the tube here because there's no way to cover the end of the tube. So I'm going to have to backtrack to the closest intersection where I can end this tube in the under position. The beginning of the next tube should overlap the end of the previous tube by about 1/4 of an inch so that both raw edges will eventually be hidden under a crossing line. Here the overlapped area is highlighted with another red circle. And my next stopping point, I've trimmed the end of the tube and I'm about to slide the end of the tube underneath the tube that was already glued down. This is why we never put glue in the intersections. Now I'm continuing to work my way around the design, referring to the paper pattern as I go to keep track of the overs and unders. No raw edges of either the insets or the tubes will be exposed by the time I'm finished. A regular iron will work just fine for this. I'm using the Clover mini iron because it's lighter and also because it's easier for you to see what I'm doing. And the design is complete. Sometimes the background fabric gets a little stretched or uneven around the edges during the glue basting process. To correct for that, I sliver trimmed the block down to the correct size. Now we're ready to applique and quilt in one step. Here I've sewn my border and cornerstones onto the quilt block, and I've spray basted my quilt sandwich, quilt top, batting, and backing with 505 spray and fix temporary fabric adhesive. You can use a different basting method if you prefer. I've also stitched in the ditch in the border seams, and I have a little red arrow to point one of those out. And I've latted an echo quilting, that's the second arrow, next to each border seam. This will help keep my quilt nice and square throughout this process. Since we want the applique stitches to disappear into the fabric, I recommend using either a fine monofilament as a top thread during the applique process, and not in the bobbin, just in the top, or using a fine thread in a color and or value that will match or blend with the color of the knotwork fabric. I go into a lot more detail in the various patterns, but I especially like 100 weight micro quilter from Superior Threads, 80 weight cotton from Aurifil, or 80 weight Deco Bob from Wonderfil. These threads can all be used in both the top and the bobbin. There are lots of different options, and different machines seem to work better with different types of thread. So I always say, use whatever works best for you. Now let's talk needles. Since I'm using a very fine thread, I also recommend a very fine needle. Top stitch needles size 70-10 are my first choice since they are strong but still make a very small hole in the quilt sandwich, which can help prevent the bobbin thread from peeking up through the top of the quilt. Microtex Sharp size 70-10 are another option, but they are more fragile than the top stitch needles, and they may bend or break if you pull too hard on them while you're working. Quilting needles size 75 are slightly larger, but they also have a reinforced shaft and are therefore significantly sturdier. Now these are the brands that I use, but please feel free to use whatever brand of needles usually works best in your machine. Now let's talk recommended stitch settings. I find that a small zigzag, about the same in length and width, works best for me. And when you stitch, you want most of the stitch on the applique tube, with one side of the stitch going into the background fabric just barely off the edge of the tube. This may take some practice. I've slowed this clip way down to make it easier to see. Most of the stitch is on the green tube, but one side of the stitch goes into the background fabric, as you can see right there. Now, many machines have automatic tension control, which generally does a very good job adjusting to whatever thread you're using. However, when it comes to fine threads or monofilament threads, even high-end machines may need some minor adjusting. Adjusting the upper thread tension, if and when needed, can make a huge difference in the quality and invisibility of your stitching. This photo shows the same thread and the same stitch settings, only the upper thread tension setting is different. In the top line of stitching, the bobbin thread is peeking out and the top thread is sitting very visibly on top of the fabric. In the lower line of stitching, the upper thread tension has been reduced from 4.0 to 2.0. Your machine settings may vary, so don't get tied into those numbers. The top thread is being pulled down into the fabric, making it much less visible, even with a thread that doesn't match the color of the fabric. With everything set up and ready to go, I'll stitch all the way around the design, jumping the intersections as I go. Here I've stopped at an intersection where another line is crossing the line I'm currently stitching. Now remember, Celtic designs are characterized by unders and overs. This means you can't stitch continuously. You'll need to jump over the intersections where the line you are following goes under another line. Now it's very important to lock your stitches on either side of the jump with either a locking stitch or a back stitch. Otherwise, your stitching will come out. Jumping the intersection will leave small loops of thread on both the front and back of your quilt. Don't worry about those. You can trim them off at the end. Make sure that your needle is always up in the highest position before each jump, and that you don't forget to lock your stitches on the other side as well. Here's what it looks like in action, slowed down so that you can see what is happening. You can also see that I've folded the right-hand side of the quilt to make it easier to maneuver in my sewing machine. Now I'm just about to the intersection. There's my locking stitch. Now I'm going to raise the needle to its highest position, slide the fabric over, lower the foot, another locking stitch, and away we go. It's just that easy. Here's an example of an intersection where the tube I'm stitching is in the over position. This time, I can just keep on stitching right through the intersection without stopping. No jumping needed. And there you have it. Everything has been sewn down, which means the layers have been quilted together. Here's a view from the back, and here's a close-up of the final view from the back. You can see that just for fun, I added a bit of echo quilting on either side of my appliqué tubes. And I also added echo quilting at the outer point of each arm of the central cross. Next, I added an optional hanging sleeve, and directions are included in the pattern. And finally, I bound the outer edges of the quilt. If you'd like to try Celtic appliqué yourself, I've linked my online shop in the description. You'll find both the Celtic Blessings and True Lover's Knot patterns available as downloadable PDFs. Thanks so much for watching. And if you're not already subscribed, I'd love to have you join me for more quilting tips and inspiration in the future.